Chapter 2 continued. They walked by Travers's all-day breakfast, and Clem looked in the windows at people eating eggs and sausages, drinking hot coffee. There was the door. He could just step through that door and sit down at a table, and maybe the day wouldn't happen. But his feet kept moving toward the American Bee Mine. One more glance in the window showed Lonnie Travers pouring coffee for a customer, smiling in a pretty way that reminded him of his teacher, Ms. Pipe. Clemson? Clem realized Pap's rambling voice had lifted and was hanging in the air. What? He looked blankly at Pap. I said, are you pleased? Pap's expression was sober, as always, but bright, expectant. Clem slowed his step, and Pap walked ahead. Pleased? How could he be? Well, come on then, Pap said over his shoulder. Clem hurried to catch up, his dinner pail banging against the side of his thigh. Oh, I know it might not seem like that much, heading down for a long day of it like we are, Pap said, his voice warming in a way Clem wasn't used to. But I tell you what, Clemson, we're part of it. The two of us now, we're part of the land, part of the Ozark Mountains themselves. Clem swallowed hard and tried for a joke. I'd rather be part of Wapapello Lake, fishing for carp. Pap was silent. Clem sighed, almost a groan. Or part of my own backyard, playing fetch with the dog I don't have. It came out whining. He kicked a stone down the street ahead of them. You know your ma won't have a dog, Pap said. She spoils you plenty, boy, but, he frowned, no dog. Clem swung his dinner pail in an arc. She wouldn't even have to do anything. I'd keep him outside, Pap. I'd feed him. I'd take good care of him. Pap held up a hand and pursed his lips. Clem caught up to the stone and kicked it again. Now the chat dump rose up like the hump of a ridgy-backed beast ahead of them, making the buildings look insignificant. It taunts the olden peaks that pen it in and give it birth, Clem said. Pap scowled at him. It's from a poem. I wrote it at school. Pap grunted. Poetry is beside the point, he said. Makes it sound silly. Then he frowned. Miss Pipe says you're sharp, and I know it, Clem. I know it. With the high marks and the reading, heck, you already read more books than I ever did. Clem kicked the stone ahead. I've always been proud to be a miner. You'll take to it. The lead's the only game in town, Clem, and we need the money. If we didn't, I'd let you grow up and be a doctor. Clem's heart leapt. Maybe he could turn around right now and go back. Maybe Pap wouldn't make him go down into the deep dark. Be good to have a doctor in the house, Pap said, but his voice had gone hard. Then he laughed. Pap was only joking then, about being a doctor. Clem shifted his dinner pail to the other hand and cut a glance at Pap. Clem could see he was thinking of Esther, and the bills. Now Clem looked up at the chat conveyor that ran like a scar up the steep slope. Rail cars dumped their loads of rocky debris, even at this hour. If his feet kept moving, he was really going to go down there and fill those very rail cars. He watched as one car dumped its load of spent rock and earth. They followed the road around the great mountain of that chat pile, and when Clem saw the rolling mill, the powder shack, the office, the head frame rising stark as gallows against the sky, any poetic thought left him. It was everything exactly the same as he'd ever seen 100 times before, but it all looked somehow different, somehow dirtier, older, more ominous, like old ruins. About 50 miners stood around, waiting for the shift change. Clem recognized some of them. Burnell Holdman crushed a cigarette under his boot heel and nodded over at them, smoke coming out of his nostrils like a dragon. Orville Pullen leaned against the head frame that housed the hoisting sheaves, the pullings that would soon be heard protesting the great loads of ore the men would dig. Elmer Schuler coughed into a handkerchief. Clem held his cap lamp against his stomach. When he moved, the early morning sunlight glanced off the Just Right's nickel plate. This was the only silvery new carbide lamp in sight. He swallowed and looked down his boots. We got a new recruit. Clem turned. It was a man he knew, Mr. Sawyer. The old miner squinted watery eyes at the boy. You afeard, young Clemson? Pap was named Clemson. Grampy, too. Clem hoped Mr. Sawyer wouldn't call him young Clemson forever. Nope, Clem said. I'm not afraid. His voice sounded loud and phony. Well, you ought to be, said Mr. Sawyer. Don't let Saw trouble you, Pap said. He does enjoy having himself a gruesome tale. He started walking off, leaving Clem there with the dinner pails and old straw. Clem called out to him, Pap, I gotta go check us in with the shift boss, Pap said. Clem watched him till he disappeared into the office. The moment the door swung shut behind Pap, old Saw leaned forward. Stringy gray hair hung around his white, sickly-looking face. His cheeks sank in where he was missing some teeth. A whiff of his breath made Clem figure what teeth remained were rotting in his head. You know, I've worked the mines all along the Ozarks lead belt, he said. Fredericksburg to Bonne Terre. He had a whiny voice and a way of putting an extra H sound at the start of words that didn't belong there. Hugh for you. High for I. Heavy on the H in words like why and what. Now the old miner swept a hand back over his shoulder and then shot a bony finger northeast, past the sun. Y'all along the lead belt, he said. He scratched the sandpapery gray stubble that lined his jaw and looked Clem up and down. Boy, I got some stories that'll like it to curl your hair. Old saws were the kind of stories that had made Clem afraid of the dark in the first place. About 4 years ago, a rough colleague of mine called Charlie Underwood died a horrible death, Sawyer began. Clem glanced around again to see if anybody might be going to rescue him, but nobody was. Charlie used to ride the shaft cage whenever it was called to the different levels of the mine. Not moments before his death, he took me and a bunch of boys on the crew down to begin our shift. We'd only gone a little ways from the shaft when we heard something. We ran back, and what do you know we saw? Why, it's a sight I'll not soon forget. Clem looked at him and shook his head. It was Charlie Underwood's mess of a body. Fell 200 feet down the shaft to his death. I'll spare you the rest. He smacked his lips, as if holding back the gory details gave him as much of a charge as telling it. Old Saw sat back and slapped his thighs. What do you think of that? Give you a case of the heebie-jeebies, don't it? He cackled. Yes, sir. Clem ran a hand across his jaw. Pap came over. Come on, he said. Leadman says we're all set. Old Saw stood up. We'll talk more later, he said, and he pointed a bony finger at Clem before he shuffled away. Clem felt sick. They walked over to the clean and change house, and Pap showed Clem where to stow his dinner pail and clean clothes for later. Then they picked up their tools, pick, shovel, and sledge, and went to the elevator. He didn't want to set foot inside that cage. 18 or 20 of the men pressed into the cage, and the shaft operator closed the door. The elevator jerked once, and then began to sink. Clem looked up, and through the metalwork grill, he watched the square of daylight shrink smaller and smaller, and then disappear. He breathed evenly, trying to be calm against the gathering dark. He clutched his cap to his chest, and he choked out a word, one small, dry whisper of a prayer. God. Whew!